Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So we're continuing now with Hidayah, and if you remember last lesson we were talking about the ushur. So the idea is that there is land, and this land has produce. You have to give zakat on that produce, and Abu Hanifa rahimahullah has mentioned that you have to give it on any amount, whereas Imam Sahibain, they say no, it has to come up to a certain amount. Right, that certain amount is 5 wasaqs. Okay, so we mentioned about the 5 wasaqs, and this was something that we discussed in detail, right, what they mean by 5 wasaqs. Okay, so now we're going to go to the next masala. So this is وَمَا سُقِيَ بِغَرْبٍ أَوْ دَالِيَةٍ أَوْ سَانِيَةٍ. So مَا سُقِيَ, any land that has been irrigated, بِغَرْبٍ. So gharb, dalia, saniya, these are various types of ways in the olden days that they used to irrigate land. Nowadays we have hose pipes, and the hose pipe simply is a way of irrigation. Yeah, so you might have sprinkler system, hose pipe system. So in the olden days they would have the gharb, dalia. So gharb is basically like a large vessel of you put water into it, and then you basically just put it onto an animal's back, and then you go with it. Dahlia is something which is similar as well, some sort of a contraption that you have that can irrigate the land. Sania is a type of animal as well they usually have, which some say it's saqiya, some versions saqiya, this one says sania. These are all basically just means of irrigation. So as long as the water has not been fed naturally to the land, and it's fed through some artificial way, then فَفِيهِ نِصْفُ الْأُشْرِ, then in it will be half of an ushur. So if an ushur is 10%, half of an ushur is 5%. عَلَى الْقَوْلَيْن, according to both qawls, qawl of Abu Hanifa and qawl of the Sahibain. Meaning, when there is exerted some sort of an effort into irrigating the plants, the amount of zakat you have to give is going to decrease, right? A reduction. Why is this for? He says, لِأَنَّ الْمُؤُونَةَ, because the burden, تَكْثُرُ فِيهِ, so the burden of taking care of the plants and feeding them has increased now because you're putting more effort into it. As opposed to if there was a guy who was simply planted the seeds, he sowed the seeds, and the rain came, or the floods came, or the water came from the channels, and they irrigated the land. Right? He hardly did anything for that. So the idea is when the mu'una increases, mu'una means burden, yeah, the kulfa, the burden. So when the burden increases, then the obligation decreases, right? And when the burden is less, the obligation is more. وَتَقِلُّ فِيمَا يُسْقَى بِالسَّمَاءِ أَوْ سَيْحًا. وَتَقِلُّ means the burden is lowered or decreases. فِيمَا يُسْقَى بِالسَّمَاءِ أَوْ سَيْحًا, that which has been irrigated through the sky, meaning rain, أو سَيْحًا meaning water, floods, rivers, etc. So, in other words, natural. وَإِن سُقِيَ سَيْحًا وَبِدَالِيَةٍ. Okay, what if it's irrigated through two ways? So let's say, for example, on some occasions you got this big field. Sometimes you actually use the water from the river. Yeah, you let the river, like you open the channels of the river and the water comes flooding in, and it floods the land. You use that method sometimes, and sometimes you use the dahlia method, right? So you use this, carrying the water to. So what if you use both methods? So then he says, al-mu'tabaru aktharu sanati. In that case, what you're going to look at is the majority of the year. So whatever the majority of the year is, so 6 months. So if you had, let's say, 7 months you were using artificial means of irrigation, and the rest of the months, 5 months you were natural, then you consider the 7 months. So you consider it to be artificial. But if its majority, more than 6 months, is naturally irrigated, then you'd have to give it an ushur, 10th. كما مر في السائمة. So he says this masala is similar to the one that we discussed in the saima. So if you remember when we talked about the grazing animals, we said that if the owner of the animals was to feed the animals more than 6 months, the animal is considered to be an animal which is like domestically fed. And if it feeds for more if it feeds on its own naturally in the pastures For more than 6 months, then it's considered to be a saima, a self-grazing one. So, okay, that's done. وقال أبو يوسف رحمه الله فيما لا يوسق كالزعفران والقطن يجب فيه العشر إذا بلغت قيمته قيمة خمسة أوسق من أدنى ما يوسق. Abu Yusuf rahimahullah, he says, look, remember Abu Hanifa says, everything the ground produces, you have to give an ushur for it. And Abu Yusuf and Muhammad say, no, it has to reach the level of 5 wasaqs. So now we know, for example, like in English terms, we have things like pounds and kilos and tons, right? These are the kind of measures that we have. So different things are measured in different ways. So for example, let's say someone is going to be measuring, I don't know, steel. Someone's measuring steel, right? So steel is measured, obviously it's going to be measured in kilos and tons. And in the airports, when you put your bags on the machine, they measure them in kilos. But sometimes certain things are actually measured in a lesser weight. So now obviously we have grams as well, and maybe even smaller, and we have ounces and we have pounds and all these different weights. In the olden days, if you were selling different items, you might have a different weighing scale for different things, right? Because of the size of them. So there might be something which is very small, like saffron. Saffron is very, very small. You're not going to buy too much saffron. You're not going to buy like a ton of saffron, right? You're going to buy at best a kilo of saffron, right? People sell saffron in grams, 1 gram of saffron, 2 grams of saffron. And like, for example, in this country, 1 gram of saffron can cost you about £4. £4 per gram. So, it's expensive. So he says, how do you weigh saffron then? If you were to use the 5 wasaq system, in the saffron, no saffron producer is going to have to give zakat, right? Because no one produces 5 wasaq amount. So 5 wasaq is about 950, let's say, kilos. No one produces that kind of quantity. So he says, what does that person do? So Abu Yusuf differs with Imam Muhammad on this. Abu Yusuf says, anything that does not fall under the wasaq, meaning anything that's produced and is not normally reaches the level of 5 wasaqs, its measuring scale is of a smaller or a different amount. So for example, like saffron and cotton. So cotton as well is very different, because cotton is very light. So it's large, but it's light. So he says, in those things, يجب فيه الأشر. Ushur will be necessary in these إذا بلغت قيمته قيمة 5 أوسق, when its value reaches the value of 5 wasaqs. So when its value reaches the value of 5 wasaqs, then you have to give. So how does he do that then? So what you do basically, أدنى ما يوسق. So let's say, for example, let's say I have this cup. What I do is, imagine this is, for example, the wasaq measure, right? The measurement. I take the smallest thing that is normally measured by wasaqs. Like, let's say the smallest thing is barley. I don't know. I'm just making this up to explain. So let's say the smallest thing that's used in the normal markets is barley to measure. And you find out, if I had 5 wasaqs of barley, how much would that cost? So let's say 5 wasaqs of barley costs £500. You go, okay, 500 is going to be your nisab now. So if you make saffron and the value of the saffron is equal to 500 now, you're going to have to give zakat on it. Does that make sense? Yeah. So in other words, the zakat is going to be necessary. The ushur is going to be necessary for the smallest thing that comes into it. So the smallest they usually mention as the cheapest thing, like the smallest. The cheapest thing that comes into it is adna, used for the smallest or cheapest. So adna means smallest, but they in reference, like in the commentaries, they mention that it's referring to the smallest in sale wise, right? The least thing that they. So you look at that, and whatever it comes up to, and then you're obviously going to use, you're going to use that as the measure. Okay, so this is 500 and then 500. كالذرة في زماننا, like dharra in our times. Yeah, so like dharra, the dharra is the smallest thing. It's like small little seeds. لأنه لا يمكن التقدير الشرعي فيه. Yeah, because the reason we're using this qima, we're going to compare it with the qima, is because we are going to check it with, because there's no other shari'i way for us to measure saffron. There's no other way. Because we only have, in the hadith mentioned, wasaqs. So we can't come out with our own measurement. So لأنه لا يمكن تقدير الشرعي فيه, because تقدير الشرعي in it is not possible, right? Because there's nothing mentioned. So what do? We اعتبرت قيمته. So now we're going to shift towards the qima now. So when we're not able to use one thing, what we do is we shift to the other thing, right? Just like, for example, when it comes to, like in usul, when it comes to qada, yeah. So for example, if you're not able to do the qada fil, suratan wa ma'nan, then you shift to ma'nan only, right? So if you're not able to pray the salat with the jama'ah, then you pray the salat on your own, yeah. Or if you're not able to compensate someone for damaging their property by giving them a physical, identical replica of it, then you have to give it the value of it. So فَاعْتُبِرَتْ قِيمَتُهُ. So therefore, in that case, the qima is going to be considered to be the next best thing. Because what Imam Abu Yusuf is saying is that the qima is something in Sharia. The qima is a relevant thing. Like we see in the Sharia, the qima being used quite a lot. So qima, he's saying that we use this in Sadaqat al-Fitr as well. So in Sadaqat al-Fitr, the four things, right? Nowadays, when you go to the mosques, they'll say to you, Sadaqat al-Fitr is £4 or £5 or whatever. Right? What they're doing is they're saying that Sharia, it actually wants to give the qima of that thing to the poor. Kama fi urud al-tijara, just like in urud al-tijara as well. So just like in urud al-tijara, as you know, if you're a businessman and you have a large stock, right? How do you measure if it's reached nisab? So you look at the value of it. You don't look at weight, you don't look at measure, you look at value. So value is considered to be important in. This is Imam Abu Yusuf Rahimullah's argument. And according to Imam Muhammad, what does he say? Qala Muhammad. So remember, Abu Yusuf says the smallest thing that is going to fit into that is going to be measured. And the smallest thing is the dharra, and this is usually the cheapest thing as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be the cheapest thing, but he's saying in our times it's the dharra. وقال Muhammad, and Imam Muhammad says يجب العشر إذا بلغ الخارج. So ushr is necessary when the produce reaches خمسة أعداد. It reaches 5 times من أعلى ما يقدر به نوعه. 5 times the most premium of that thing in which its type is measured. Yeah, so the most أعلى ما يقدر به نوعه. Yeah. So what does that mean then? So basically what he's saying is, let's say you got saffron. So in saffron, so what is the highest measure that is used in saffron to measure? Right, so you're going to take that and then you're going to use that and multiply by 5. Okay, and if it reaches, so if you have produced enough saffron that fits into 5 of those measures, that's like 5 wasaqs for the other produce. So it's as though the concept here that Imam Muhammad is looking at is the concept of the wasaq is really trying to show that it has to be the measure that's normally used for that particular thing. So what's the normal measure used for that thing? Then you look at that, 5 times that. So he says, إذا بلغ الخارج, when the produce reaches 5 times من أعلى ما يقدر. Remember, Abu Yusuf is looking at adna. He's looking at the thing that goes into it. أعلى ما يقدر به. Imam Muhammad looking at the measure itself, the cup. So Imam Muhammad looking at the cup, whereas Imam Abu Yusuf looking at the thing that goes into it. ما يقدر به نوعه فاعتبر في القطن 5 أحمال. So he's saying when it comes to cotton, you look at 5 himals, 5 ahmals. Ahmal is basically a camel load. Yeah, so a himal is a camel load. So 5 camel loads. So because cotton is not measured in wasaqs. So what you do is the normally when people in the society they use the camels, they sell the cotton, they sell it in himals, ahmals. So you look at that then, that's the measure that's used. And that's the highest measure. So hamal is the highest measure for cotton. Obviously cotton is going to have smaller measures that they use as well. But if they're selling on a wholesale level, then it's going to be of that. كل حمل 300 من. Every himal is basically what the load that a camel can carry. So roughly a camel can carry about 200 kilos, you can say. Yeah, it's about 200 kilos, give or take, camel carry. So it kind of works out to be almost the same, you can say. So حمل 300 من. كل حمل, every himl is equal to 300 man. Right, so everyone is equal to 300 man. Now, how much obviously is a man? That's something which he's going to mention later on, how much these measurements equal to. وفي الزعفران, and when it comes to saffron, خمسة أمناء. So this works out to be 5 amna. Again, what is an amna? I mean, I don't have those sort of apparatus or measuring tools, instruments to measure it with. But خمسة amna is going to be something by which the normal traders would use when they were selling, and this was like the largest. Like the people do not sell larger than this. لأن التقدير بالوسق. So he says the reason why he's using measure is because he's saying the taqdir in the hadith, the measurement through wasaq, كان باعتبار أنه أعلى ما يقدر به نوعه, because that was the أعلى, the most premium, or the highest rather. Premium is better than the highest measure. Yeah, the highest measure that was used to measure that particular type of produce. So like I said, just like in our times today, when people are selling things, people sell them with different types of weights. Gold is sold at a certain weight, and So he says this is because so Imam Abu Yusuf is saying the hadith is actually talking about what goes in there. So in other words, you look at what goes into the 5 wasaqs and you look at the value. And Imam Muhammad saying no, you don't look at value, you actually look at the measure. وفي العسل. So that's finished now. Now Imam Aini has actually mentioned a whole discussion on this man issue. Yeah, so this man, so is this man from amna? Yeah, is it from amna, or is it from like amna with the hamza at the end, or is it from amna without hamza at the end? Is this considered to be from the original word manan, right, with the hamza? Actually, let me just show you guys this. So I'm not going to read all of it. I'm just going to show you, because otherwise it's going to get a bit long. Yeah, so there's a whole discussion that he has on the man issue. Okay, so okay, so he says so he has a whole discussion on the gharb issue. You can check that out all yourselves. Actually, you guys can't see, so I'll show you guys. So he says over here, this whole discussion over here that he's got about the gharb, what's a saniya, saqiya, yeah, تجارة. Okay, here's that اختلاف. Okay, so قال محمد يجب الأشهر إذا بلغ الخارج 5 أعداد من أعلى ما يقدر به نوعه. Okay, so over here he says ثلاثمائة إذا بلغ خارج 5 أعداد على ما يقدر 300 من بالعراقي كذا قال الجساس وهي 600 رطل. So he's saying that the man is equal to 600 rittles. Yeah, 600 rittles. والجملة 3000 رطل بالبغدادي, and in total 300 من 3000 رطل بغدادي is equal to 3000 rittles according to the Baghdadi measure. So you have the Iraqi measure, the Baghdadi. لأنك تقول عندي أوقية ورطل. Then he goes on. Then he says أمنا إنما قال أمنا لأن مفردها منا. قال الجوهري المن مقصور, so with the alif at the end, الذي يوزن به, والتثنية منوان, والجمع أمنا, وهو أفصح من المن. So this is, it was better for him to actually have used that. وتثنية المن. So in other words, this is a different, أمنا is a different measure than the man that was mentioned previously. Right, so there are two different measures. So you can have a look at that. So over here then he says, he says اعتبر الوسق وهي في زماننا. وسق in our times كان باعتبار أنه أعلى ما يقدر. In them days was the most highest measure that they used to use in cups. فوجب على هذا أن يعتبر في كل نوع, and that's why he says in every item, every produce, the highest measure, the أعلى premium measure should be used to measure. So for example, he says in cotton it should be حمل يقدر أولا بالأساتير, because normally when it comes to cotton, people usually use as the smallest scale, they use أساتير, then they use أمناء, then they use حمل. ثم بعده تضعيف الحمل, and then they used to use himels after that. Just like after tons, there isn't really anything larger than tons. وأما الزعفران فيقدر أولا. So saffron, first of all, أوقية is used. أوقية is a very, very small measure. And then ritl is used. And then man is used. ثم بعده تضعيف المن. And that is used after that. And he goes on. Yeah, so you can have a look at that, inshallah. Again, these measurements that are mentioned in here, there's books that are written by the Hanafis on these measurements called Al-Awzan al-Shar'iyya. Yes, Maqadir and Awzan al-Shar'iyya. So you can have a read of those. Yeah, and those are to do with conversions at our times. And if you can read Urdu, then Mufti Shafi actually has a risala in his collection of Jawahir al-Fiqh, in which he actually goes through explaining about measurements in India and Pakistan as well. Right, so let's go back to this. So he says, وَفِي الْأَصْل, next masala. What about honey? Do you have to give zakat on honey? As in, does honey come under the produce of the earth, or is it considered to be something separate? So Imam Shafi rahimahullah, he says it's separate. And the Hanafi say no, honey is actually considered to be like a produce of the earth. How is that? وفي الأصل العشر, in asal, in honey, you have to give an ushur إذا أخذ من أرض الأشر, so long as the honey is collected from ushur land. Yeah. Now, ushur land and kharaj land is something I've talked about before. However, Imam Aini actually discusses 10 types of ushur land and 8 types of kharaj land he talks about. Yeah. How is a land declared to be ushur? He mentions 10 scenarios. And how is the land declared to be kharaj? It mentions 10 scenarios. And that's going to be important for the coming text, right? So we might cover it today or next week. So he says, وَفِي الْعَسَلِ الْأُشْرِ إِذَا أُخِذَ, and when it comes to honey, you have to give a tenth, إِذَا أُخِذَ, so long as it's taken from ushur land. قال الشافعي رحمه الله. Imam Shafi, on the other hand, he says, لا يجب, it's not necessary to give zakat on it. Why? Because he says, لأنه متولد من الحيوان. So he says, look, where does honey come from? It comes from an insect. And there is no zakat at any other insect excretion, like silk or anything like that. So he says, فَأَشْبَهَ الْإِبْرِيسِمْ, Ibrisam is silk. So he's saying that just like when a silkworm produces silk, you don't have to give an ushur on that. Why would you have to give ushur on the honey that's produced from a bee? Right, it's not land produce. Land produce is the one that you have to give ushur. وَلَنَا, and our response, قَوْلُهُ عَلَيْهِ السَّلَامِ, the Prophet ﷺ statement, فِي الْعَسَلِ الْأُشْرِ, that when it comes to asal, you have to give an ushur. Yeah, so al-ushur is the mubtada muakhar, fil asal is the khabar muqaddam. Again, this is for like ta'keed, or this is for, like we say, hasr. Yeah, لَيْسَ الْأُشْرُ إِلَّا فِي الْعَسَلِ, meaning fil asal al-ushur, you have to give ushur, in asal. وَلِأَنَّ النَّحْلَ, and the rational argument is this. So look, difference between a bee and between silk as well. Bees, nahl, يتناول من الأنوار. Anwar is like plants. Okay, so from the pollen. والثمار, so from flowers and from fruit. So they take from them. وَفِيهِمَا الْأُشْرِ, and you have to give ushur in those. So in the anwar, which is the jama of noor, right, which is like blossoming, when the fruit plants are blossoming. So the bees come and they pollinate it, and then obviously the whole process starts. So he says that is, the bee takes it from there, and then that produces, obviously. So the honey actually does not come from the bee directly. It actually comes from, it's because the raw material for the honey is actually pollen. فَكَذَا فِيمَا يَتَوَلَّدْ مِنْهُمَا. So just like you have to give zakat on that fruit and vegetables that come out from those plants, likewise you have to give zakat, ushur, on whatever is yatawallad, whatever is produced minhuma, from these two things. Right. So this is the argument. Now, are there any other insects out there that produce something that humans consume? Yeah, and then I don't think there's any other that humans consume at the level of honey. Maybe, for example, like in today's times, you have, shellac from beetles that's produced. Maybe that is also can be considered like the bee as well. I don't know. You have to look in the animal kingdom. بخلاف دود القز, as opposed to دود القز. Yeah, دود القز. So دود القز, this is different. So qaz is silk. Yeah, دود is worm. So as opposed to silkworms. لأنه يتناول من الأوراق. So look, there is a subtle difference. Yes, silkworms do eat leaves, but those leaves, there's no zakat on leaves. It's actually on the flowers, those blossoming flowers that grow into fruit and veg. Or one can argue even like a cow. Yeah, like a cow produces milk, and that milk is produced from eating grass, but that grass isn't something which is zakatable. لأنه يتناول من الأوراق, because these worms, they consume the awraq. ولا أشر فيها, and there's no ushur in there. So that's answered that issue. So what's the khulasa of this? Khulasa of this is there zakat when it comes to honey? We say yes, there is. Shafi says no, there isn't. Imam Shafi considers it to be like a silkworm, in the sense that silkworms produce silk, and we don't have to give zakat on it. And according to Hanafis, we say that no, it's not like silkworm. It's different. Yeah. First of all, there is ushur. There is ushur because of the hadith, and the second is because the bees, they eat from the blossoming flowers that produce the. So if you ever seen a flower that produces fruit, yeah, it eats from there, and obviously it can eat from other flowers as well. But the point is that what they're saying is that the bee, because the Prophet ﷺ has said it in the hadith, we're using this as our basis, that it must be because they eat from the flowers, and those flowers then pollinate, and then that pollination allows the fruit to grow. Right. So it's like part of the whole system of the fruit. So the fruit come into existence because of the bees as well, and then that honey is produced from that. So there's no ushur on flowers; it's on fruit and veg. So that's our response. And then we say that the silkworms eat leaves, and those leaves, there's no zakat on leaves. ثم عند أبي حنيفة يجب فيه العشر قل أو كثر. So then, according to Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, ushur is necessary qalla, whether the amount of honey that's produced is small or whether it's a large amount produced. Yeah, so small, large amount. Because Imam Hanifa's rule is that it doesn't matter how much is produced, you have to give zakat. Give zakat, like the Quran says, وَآتُوا حَقَّهُ يَوْمَ حَصَادِهِ. Yeah. أَنْفِقُوا مِمَّا رَزَقَنَاكُمْ وَمِمَّا أَخْرَجْنَا لَكُمْ مِنَ الْأَرْضِ. Yeah, that which you produce from the land. So you can see how the Hanafis now, although the Quran is saying مِمَّا أَخْرَجْنَا لَكُمْ مِنَ الْأَرْضِ, the idea is that bee has some sort of like, that honey is actually from the ard. It has some sort of a connection with the ard, and therefore that is something which we consume. Yeah, just like the fruit we consume. Yeah, so can you see the connection there? So the fruit we consume, the bees, even if they don't eat from fruit trees or plants, doesn't matter. The point is that we do eat the honey. لأنه, this is قل أو كثر لأنه لا يعتبر النصاب. Yeah, because he does not consider nisab. Yeah. What if flowers are farmed for sale? No. So it's only for, remember, ushur is only for eating. Yeah, things that are for eating purposes. Yeah, that's it. It's just eating. No, sorry. It can possibly be for certain types of things that are deliberately grown. For, like, remember we said before regarding if a person was to grow, like Sahibain obviously say that it has to be grown for to be able to last for over a year. That's why they would say there's no zakat in plants, khudrawat, nothing in greens, nothing that can rot in a few weeks. But Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, if a person was to deliberately grow plants for sale purposes, or not even for sale purposes, on a large scale, was to grow them in the garden, then there possibly would be some ushur on that as well. But then it would have to have some qima in the markets. It'd have to have some sort of value. Yeah, so it's not just like you're growing in your garden flowers, plants like that. What about roses? You can make a rose preserve. I mean, in that case, you can preserve anything. You can preserve mangoes. You can preserve apples. Right? That's not the point. The point is not whether you can desiccate it and dry out. The point is that it naturally can be preserved. It's naturally is preserved. That's the idea. Okay, so and if you remember, we said things that naturally grow in places, there's no zakat in those, like bamboo and grass and those kind of things. Right. وعن أبي يوسف رحمه الله أنه يعتبر فيه قيمة خمسة أوسق. So again, he's going to use the value of the خمسة أوسق. So if a person produces honey, you look at how much honey they produce. So if they produce a large amount of honey, then that large amount of honey that you have, has it reached the level of 5 wasaqs or not? كما هو أصله, just like it's the asl according to Imam Hanifa. وعنه, and there's another riwayah from Imam Abu Yusuf on this, أنه لا شيء فيه, that there is no zakat when it comes to honey, حتى يبلغ 10 قرب, until it reaches 10. Qirab is basically like a leather bag. Yeah, so in the olden days they used to preserve things in leather bags. Leather bags was used for like a container. So 10 qirab, until it reaches 10 qirabs, wherever that qirab measure was. So in other words, Imam Abu Yusuf seems to have two riwayahs on this. One riwayah is in accordance with his asl, his principle, which is we're going to look at qima. And the other riwayah is the qirab one. Why is this? لحديث بني شبابة أنهم كانوا يؤدون إلى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم كذلك. Yeah, because of the hadith of Banu Shababa, that they used to give the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم zakat in bags, right? So in 10 bags. Now Imam Zayla'i, and then after him Imam Fath al-Qadir have mentioned a whole discussion on this hadith of Banu Shababa hadith, right? So you can check it out there. They got a whole in Binaya as well. He's got like about 2-3 sides where he discusses this whole hadith about this. And over here in the bottom, he just mentioned it briefly. Yeah, this is the hadith. عمرو شعير أبيه جدي أن بني شبابة بطن من فهم كانوا يؤدون. They used to give the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم على نحل كان لهم العشر, 10th of the honey, من كل عشر قربة, من كل 10 قرب, every 10 bags they would give 1 bag. But anyway, you can look at the discussion of the hadith over there. So now Imam Abu Yusuf got a third opinion now. وعنه خمسة أمناء, right? So 5 months. So therefore, this is the weakest of the 3 opinions. So the strongest opinion is the qima one, because that is based upon the takhrij of his other masail, and also this other opinion based on the hadith as well. But the third opinion, the khamsatu amna, this is in the غير ظاهر riwayah. وعن Muhammad, and now Imam Muhammad obviously he was also going to say you have to have a certain amount. So what does he say? He says khamsatu afraq. So he says you have to use the farq measure because remember he says أعلى ما يقدر به نوعه, the highest measure that's used to measure that particular thing. So he says خمسة أفراق كل فرق ستة وثلاثون رطلا. Every farq is equal to 36 rittles. So every farq is 36 rittles. Right? So one farq is 36 rittles and then 36 times 5. That's the amount. And if you remember, we said every sa' contains 4 rittles. Right? So a sa' is made up of 3.2 liters. And then every sa' contains 8 rittles, 4 mud. So 8. So 36 has how many 8s in 36? For about, almost about 5. Almost 5. 4.8. Right, so 4.8 sa' and 4.8 times 3.2. So say about about 5 times 3, which equals 15. So 15 liters is one farq. Almost 15 liters is one farq, you could say. And then times that by 5. So 15 times 5, that would work out to be what the measure would be then. Yeah, 70, 75-ish. So in other words, about 75 liters of honey, you give a tenth of that. لأنه أقصى ما يقدر به. So this is the highest, أقصى, the highest measure that's used to measure honey in them days. Remember, so he's sticking to his principle, whereas Abu Yusuf has 3 qawls in this. وكذا في قصب السكر. Right, and likewise when it comes to قصب السكر. So قصب السكر, this is seems to be some sort of a substance that was taken out of some bamboo. It might be in reference to sugarcane. Yeah, so qasb al-sukr could be referring to sugarcane, or it could be referring to some other type of plant that they had in them days. So he says, وَكَذَا فِي قَصْبِ السُّكَّرِ وَمَا يُوجَدْ فِي الْجِبَالِ, and those things that are found in mountains, min al-asli, like honey and thimar, right? You have to also give zakat in them as well. So in other words, it's not just something that you have on private land as well. So if you're growing something in the mountains as well, then you have to get, and we mentioned about this before. We said, what's the ruling of the ushr of land outside of your private property? Now over here it says, وكذا في قصب السكر قال الأطراري يعني أن في السكر يعتبر 5 أمناء عند محمد. So according to Muhammad, in this particular sweet substance that was taken out, there you have to work out 5 amna as well, because amna was the measure that was used for that highest measure. وخمسة أوسق عند Abu Yusuf, and Imam Abu Yusuf says 5 wasaqs. Again, we don't have a qawl from them. This is more based upon takhrij. عند وهو على هذا البيان عطف, and then he goes عطف على أقرب والمعنى كذا أقصى ما يقدر, and likewise the highest measure that's used في السكر الذي هو 36 رطلا. Anyway, so going back to this then. وعن أبي يوسف, and there is also a riwayah from Imam Abu Yusuf rahimahullah regarding these wild grown things. عن أبي يوسف أنه لا يجب, that it's not necessary to give zakat on these things. Yeah, the قصب السكر وما يوجد في الجبال, etc. لإنعدام السبب. Yeah, because the sabab is not there, because his sabab is this. هي الأرض النامية, is productive land. So the wild is not considered to be productive land because it isn't considered to be in the ownership of anyone. So it doesn't fall under productive land. So Abu Yusuf rahimahullah limits, therefore he limits it to owned land, yeah, ownership. Whereas Imam Muhammad, he doesn't limit to owned land, he limits it to what the land, the thing that's grown the land, or the land itself. Wajhul Zahir, so the apparent, meaning the dalil, Wajhul Zahir means the dalil for the apparent text. أن المقصود حاصل وهو الخارج. Imam Muhammad's argument, that's the Zahir, that look, the maqsood is achieved, which is the kharij. So Imam Muhammad looking at the produce from the land, whereas Imam Abu Yusuf saying no, you're looking at the sabab, which is the owned land. So owned land is according to Abu Yusuf, and according to Muhammad, he says produce. So therefore, the difference is this: wherever stuff is, you grow stuff, whether it's on your private property, someone else's property, or outside, you have to give zakat on it. Whereas Abu Yusuf says, if you grow on your private property or someone else's property, and that's owned, you have to give ushur. And if you were to grow it in some place that is not owned, then there's no kharaj in there. Okay, so he says, qala. Alright, so we'll do this. قال وكل شيء أخرجته الأرض. So what's the khulasa of the previous one? Then let's just summarize the previous one. So the previous masala, the khulasa of this is: do you have to give zakat on things which do not have a specific, like do not fall under the measure of wasaq? Yes. Abu Yusuf says yes. Muhammad says yes. What do you use? Abu Yusuf says use the qima. Muhammad says you use the highest known measure for that particular produce. And so they give examples of those. What about honey? Do you have to give zakat on honey? So all the Hanafis say yes, but the amount that you have to have differs. Abu Hanifa says any amount. Imam Muhammad says you have to have those. You have to have a particular measure, which is the amna, 5 amna. And according to Abu Yusuf, he has 3 qawls in this. One is he sticks to the principle, which is the qima, and the other one is that you use the 10 leather bag ones based on the Banu Shabab hadith, and the third one is that you use amna. Yeah. Again, these are 3 opinions that are from Abu Yusuf rahimahullah. Muhammad only has 1 opinion on this. As for things that are grown in the wild, somewhere where no one owns the land, Muhammad says you have to give zakat on it. And others, Imam Abu Yusuf, he says no. It has to be considered to be owned land. Everyone understand that? Okay, now if you look in the Hashi over here, it says that although Imam Hidayah only mentioned 1 qawl of Imam Muhammad, there's actually other qawls that he didn't indicate towards. Again, in Binaya, he's mentioned multiple qawls of Imam Muhammad as well, so you can check Binaya. He says, إنما قال وعن محمد ليشير إلى به إلى أن لمحمد أيضا أقوال. Yeah, so by saying an, it means there's also other aqwal I didn't mention. وعد قال وفي السروجي. So Saruji is a commentary of Hidayah. Okay, it's a commentary of Hidayah. For the first time ever, it's actually been published. Last year it was published, I think in Turkey, I'm not sure. Yeah, it's multiple volumes. Again, if you can get your hand on it, I think it's out of stock. It'd be good because Saruji is considered one of the early commentators of Hidayah. And Muhammad أيضا 3 riwayat. إحداها, one of the riwayats is 5 qirab, 5 qirabs. Yeah, that's one. The one that we mentioned. No, actually we didn't mention that one. Wal qirbatu 50 mannan, and 1 qirba is equal to 50 mans. ذكره في الجنابي وفي المغني القربة 100 رطل. Mughni says qirba equals to 100 ritl. So if we're saying that 36 ritl is about 15, 36 ritl is about 15 liters. Yeah, so therefore 100 liters would be about 3 times that. Yeah, so 15, 45, about 45 liters. والثانية, the second opinion, 5 أمناء. Yeah, the 5 man one. And the third opinion, 5 أفراق. Yeah, so the farq, we talked about the farq. 60, 36. Okay. So these are 3 opinions that have been reported from Imam Muhammad in other books though. But the one that Imam Hidayah mentioned is the 5 farq one. Yeah, the one that we said 5 farqs is gonna work out to be 5 times, like we said, 5 times 36, yeah, or 5 times 15 liters. All right. Next. Okay. قال وكل شيء أخرجته الأرض مما فيه العشر لا يحتسب فيه أجر العمال ونفقة البقر. So it's every single thing أخرجته الأرض that the earth has produced, in which ushur is necessary. لا يحتسب فيه أجر العمال. You can't calculate in it the fee for the workers, the land workers, and the payment for the cows that you use. Yeah, so let's say people use the cows on the land to plow the land, or for harvesting. You can't include that. You can't deduct that. So basically, you have to give the ushur from the gross um, produce, and not the net produce. So the gross produce that you have basically is one before deduction. So let's say, for example, like someone produces, I don't know, 1,000 kilos of apples, or not apples, 1,000 kilos of wheat. Okay, 1,000 kilos of wheat, and he has to pay from there. So 1,000 kilos, let's say, equals £1,000. So he's got to pay from there £200 for the workers, and £200 for the other tools that he uses and everything. Okay, so he doesn't deduct the 200 and 200 and say I have to give ushur on 600, meaning I only have to give 60 pounds worth. No, he's got to give it a tenth of the entire amount before deduction. So this is why it says kullu shay'in, every single thing, akhrajatul ard, that the earth has produced, mimma fihi al-ushur, in which there is ushur, la yuhtasab fihi ajrul ummal, the ajr of the ummal, the fees of the ummal, the workers, and the nafaqa, and the expenditure of the cows, is not going to be calculated in it, meaning that you do after. لأن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم, the reason is because the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم حكم بتفاوت الواجب, yeah, because he ruled that there is the difference in the obligation is due to the difference of the burden. So therefore, if the land has been irrigated on its own, you have to give 10%, and if it's been irrigated with work, then so therefore, because the Prophet ﷺ has already taken into consideration the burden, then you can't add an extra burden in there. The burden is what the Prophet ﷺ has mentioned. So he says, فَلَا مَعْنَى لِرَفْعِهَا. Yeah, so then there is no meaning to change this, to uplift the mu'una, and to say, okay, now I'm going to deduct this, and I'm going to deduct this expenditure. So all the expenses you deduct, you don't have a right to deduct that from this, because the Prophet ﷺ has already mentioned the deduction. Yeah. Okay. So if you look at this hashi over here, he just mentions a little thing, and then we'll finish on this. Yeah. So he mentions about what he means by. So he says, look at this. He says, حكم بالتفاوت الواجب. The Prophet ﷺ, the Sharia has given a verdict بالتفاوت الواجب, that the obligation differs due to the difference in burden. فلو رفعت المؤونة كان الواجب واحدا. So if this burden was not uplifted, meaning if we ignore the burden, كان الواجب واحدا, then the wajib will all be one, meaning it's just going to be whether it's been irrigated by land, or whether it's been irrigated naturally, or whether it's irrigated by artificial means, everyone has to give an ushur. So you're uplifting that. So he says الأشر واحدا دائما في الباقي لأنه لم ينزل إلى نصفه, because it hasn't dropped down to a fifth. إلا للمؤونة. So in other words, the Sharia has only decreased it from 10 to 5% because of the burden that the kind of trouble you've gone through. والفرض أن الباقي بعد رفع قدر المؤونة. So then therefore, once you have taken into consideration whether it's been irrigated on its own or through artificial means, أن الباقي بعد رفع قدر المؤونة, so whatever remains after the mu'una, the burden, has been uplifted. So from 10%, 5% is uplifted, so you only have to give 5%. لا مؤونة فيه, there's no more mu'una. So you using cows is an extra mu'una, it's an extra burden that you're adding on that the Sharia hasn't mentioned. فكان الواجب دائما الأشر لكن الواجب قد تفاوت شرعا مرة الأشر. But however, the tafawut has occurred because the Sharia has on one occasion mentioned 10, and on one occasion has mentioned half of a tenth. فعلمنا, so we understand from that, أنه لم يعتبر شرعا, so the Sharia has not considered Adam Ushur Ba'd al Kharaj. Yeah. So the Sharia has not said that, okay, we'll exempt the expense of the cow and the workers, and then you only have to give on the rest. So in reality, what you're doing is you're coming out with your own figure, not a tenth, not something else. So for instance, like let's say we said, if you have 1,000, and you have to give a tenth, that means you have to give 100. Okay, that's a tenth. If you have 1,000 and you have to give a fifth, that means you have to give 50. Yeah. So a tenth is 105. Now, if you were to say, okay, I'm going to consider minusing the expense of the cow, 200, minus expense of the workers, 200, I've got 600 left. Now I'm going to work out a tenth on 600. So a tenth of 600 is 60, and a fifth of 600 is 30. So you've actually reduced the amount, like you remove this, and that's not permissible. Yeah, you can't do any of that. Then in the second part, he gives an example of this. لأن رفعها يستلزم عدم التفاوت المنصوص عليه, because if you were to remove this, then there's no more difference. وهو باطل وبيانه أن الخارج فيما سقط السماء. Exactly what I've said. That the produce that has been irrigated by the sky, when إذا كان 20 قفيزا, imagine it's 20 cups. ففي الأشر قفيزان. So therefore that means 1/10 of 20 is 2. وإذا كان الخارج فيما سقي بغرب. However, if the kharij that's irrigated with artificial means, 40 قفيزا, if it's 40, والمؤونة تساوي 20 قفيزا, and the mu'una, the burden that you kind of put into it, is equal to 20 قفيزا. Yeah. فإذا رفعت, now if you remove that 20 from 40, كان الواجب قفيزين, so then you'd have to give 20, you have to give 2. So therefore there's no difference, like as in you are manipulating the amounts that Sharia has mentioned without there being any justification for it. That's what he's saying. Okay, we'll finish there. If there's any questions, put them in the comments. And just to summarize what we covered today. So today's lesson, we talked about the idea of ushur is based upon the idea of if it's irrigated naturally. If, however, it's irrigated through artificial means, then you don't have to give an ushur, you give a fifth. Right? Why? Because the whole ruling revolves around burden. When you have burden, then the Sharia makes it easy for you. So it's dropped it from a tenth to a fifth. Now you can't change that. You can't say no, but I put lots of effort into it, so therefore I should only have to give 1%. No, you can't do that. Okay, what about when it comes to those things that cannot fall into the wasaq measure? So then Abu Yusuf rahimahullah comes out with this idea of qima. He says everything revolves around qima. And you basically, how do you work out the qima? Well, you take the wasaq, you put in there the smallest thing that normally people sell in there, and then you find out how much 5 of those are worth, and that's the measure, that's the nisab you're going to use. Just like in trade, in tijara, use the qima. And Imam Muhammad rahimahullah says no. He says what you do is you look for the highest measure of that particular produce that they use in the markets, and then 5 of those. Right? So in zafran, you're going to use a specific amount or whatever. And as for honey, when it comes to honey, do you have to give zakat on honey? Hanafi say yes, Shafi say no, because Shafis consider it to be like silk from worms, and worms eat leaves. So we say no, you have to give on honey. The reason is because honey is different from, because there's a hadith for it, and honey is different from silk. Honey is produced by the bee going to the flower and eating from the flower, and silk is from the worm eating from leaves. Leaves, there's no zakat. But flowers, potentially, there can be zakat in there because they can be fruitful. And even if they're not fruitful flowers, the honey itself is eaten. And what do you measure the honey in? So Abu Yusuf rahimahullah, Abu Hanifa says any amount. Abu Yusuf rahimahullah, he says you're going to use the value. That's one of his views, the value. The second is that you're going to use the 10 qirabs based on the Abanu Shabab hadith. And the third one is you're going to use khamsatu amna. Right? And Imam Muhammad rahimahullah, he says he's got one opinion, but he has more than one opinion. But for him, he's mentioned one opinion, which is the khamsat afraq. Every farq is equal to 36 rittles, and like we said, 36 rittles roughly works out to be about 4.8 sa', and that's about 15 or so liters. And then what about things that are grown in the wild? So Imam Muhammad says it's based upon any land. Abu Yusuf says no, owned land, it has to be owned. And then finally, the last masla is, what about can you deduct from your produce before calculating zakat? Can you deduct any liabilities and things? No, you can't. Okay. Is the word adana used instead of asghar because Musa uses to describe the produce of the lands as mentioned in Surah Baqarah? Allah knows best. Maybe, maybe not. Allah knows. Alright guys, take care inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.